Thank you, Richard. And it's wonderful to be here again. As Richard said, I've given talks here for 42 years, not every year, of course, but it is like a home base in London for me, and I'm very pleased that it's here. It's a great program, Alternatives, and this is a wonderful place for it to happen. I'm speaking about rediscovering God. There's actually a word for it, which you may or may not know, Anatheism. You know what theism is, belief in God. You know what atheism is, disbelief in God. Anatheism is returning to God or back to God. And it's something that is happening much more now than it ever has before. Because we live in basically a post-Christian secular society. Recent surveys show that 51% of the British population describe themselves as having no religion. I mean, this is almost unprecedented in human history. As the philosopher Charles Taylor said, in the year 1500, no one in Europe would have been an atheist. It was simply impossible, not because people were simply oppressed or forced to believe in God, but simply you couldn't conceive of a world without God and a world in which nature was not permeated by the divine spirit. It was just an inconceivable thought, except perhaps for a tiny number of people. But over the subsequent centuries, the secular option has become more and more standard, and it's now the default option of most educated people, a kind of secular atheism. In that context, there are many people who find their way back to a belief in God, but it's not quite the same kind of belief as you would have if you just always believed in God. There are still some people in Britain who are raised Christian, Jewish, Muslim, whatever, and continue with their ancestral belief. But most people, especially those from Christian backgrounds, are not in that position. And in rediscovering God, it's a completely different experience from just taking it for granted, taking God for granted from childhood onwards. Moreover, in our modern secular society, it's not a simple, straightforward path because there are so many options. A few generations ago, people just didn't know about other religious traditions. And most people in Britain were either Christian or Jewish, and there were no options. But we now have Buddhist centers, Hindu temples, Sufi centers, shamanic drumming centers, ayahuasca trips to Peru, magic mushroom retreats in the Netherlands. There's so much happening now. It's not as if it's just one option. There's a bewildering variety. And actually, this program here at St. James's is one of the places where you can learn about this variety. I mean, the program here is very varied and gives a lot of perspectives on what one could call a spiritual view of life. So what I'm going to be talking about is my own particular journey with some reflections on the bigger picture. In my own case, I was born and brought up in Newark-on-Trent in Nottinghamshire. My family were Methodists, and Methodists on both sides of the family for at least 2 or 3 generations. So I was brought up in an essentially Methodist world. And Methodists, on the whole, were very religious. I mean, we had a chapel, went to chapel every Sunday. My grandfather was the organist and choirmaster, then my uncle became the organist and choirmaster. Hymns were sung very vigorously, much more so than in the Anglican church in Newark, in the parish church. And Methodists had a kind of independent spirit. They helped each other. It was a quite fairly tight-knit community. And my experience of it was loving, helpful, supportive, and people supported each other. I then went to an Anglican boarding school, and that was a completely different take on religion. It was very high church, and I was a chorister, so I became part of the Anglican church music tradition, which I loved. I learned the organ in accordance with my family tradition. I played for services in the school chapel, and became very familiar with that, the Anglican tradition. But I was also studying science at school. I'd been inspired to do biology by my father, who was a herbalist and a pharmacist, and an amateur microscopist. He had a microscope laboratory next to my bedroom with brass microscopes with big glass domes over them, and showed me slides of kind of wonders of the microscopic world, and drops of pond water with little creatures swimming around in them. He opened my eyes to a whole world I would never have known about, at least till much later, through his microscopes. And through his interest in plants, he collected some of the herbs that he sold, and I learned the names of most common plants and trees from my father and helped collect things. And I had a collection of pressed flowers. So I was very keen on, oh, sorry about that. I was very keen on plants and also animals. I kept lots and lots of pets. I had rabbits, guinea pigs, mice, hamsters. We had a dog, goldfish, a budgerigar. I kept a jackdaw. I had pigeons, where I tested out their homing abilities by taking them on my bicycle miles from home and then releasing them and cycling home. They always got back before me. So I was really keen on biology, and I loved animals and plants. So I did biology at school. And as I studied science more, I soon realized that for my science teachers, the world of science was not an enchanted world at all. It was a world of a mechanical nature, of unconscious matter. There was no God in science. There were no spirits. There were no angels. There were no nature spirits. Animals were just machines. We learned how to vivisect and dissect animals in A-level biology. And the attitude was, this is just completely mechanical. Nature's dead, mechanical, inanimate. The mechanistic materialist theory. It was completely taken for granted. People didn't spell it out explicitly, but I absorbed it. And I realized if this is true, then religion, at best, is just a kind of personal belief system, and as a personal belief, it must be located inside your brain, since the mind's nothing but the activity of the brain. And moreover, choosing to believe it was not a real choice, because we don't have free will. It was just the way we've been indoctrinated. So I became, quite early on, a kind of atheist. About age 14, I was the only boy in my year that refused to get confirmed. And I had a housemaster who was a scientist who fueled this intellectual progress. He saw it as liberating me from the restrictions of religion. And he gave me books to read, like parts of Sir James Fraser's The Golden Bough. The point of that, he was a fairly sophisticated atheist. The point of that was to show that Christianity was really not much better than primitive animistic religions that we've been educated to look down on. It was actually just another version of the same kind of thing, with kings that die and rituals of rebirth and so on. He also gave me The White Goddess by Robert Graves to read, which was fairly heavy going. But it was really, the aim of it was to show that Christianity is no better than these animistic superstitions that we were all, everyone agreed, even the chaplain, were all things we should reject. I later came to see that as a great strength of Christianity rather than a weakness, but at the time it seemed pretty convincing. I read Freud, which showed me that God was nothing but a projection of father figures and a kind of neurotic obsession. And it was all about power. And then when I got to Cambridge, where I was a science scholar in my college, I read Marx and learned that religion was nothing but the opium of the people. I also got very involved. I joined the Cambridge Humanist Association, the atheist society. I didn't go to many meetings because I found it terribly dull. So I sort of fell away, rather, from that. I became a lapsed humanist fairly quickly. Then my main political activity, I was a very active member of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. I went on those big peace marches and I was in the big Committee of 100 Parliament Square demonstration with Bertrand Russell, where 5,000 people sat down and blocked the streets. I was arrested. My only court appearance, I had to plead guilty to obstructing the highway. I was fined 30 shillings with £2 costs at Bow Street, at St Marylebone Magistrates Court. But during this period, the atheist view just predominated. I took it for granted. It was part of the package of being a scientist. However, I began to have terrible doubts about the science itself. I'd gone into biology because I loved animals and plants. And very soon I found that the first thing we did with animals and plants to study them was to kill them. So I then dissect them or grind them up and isolate enzymes and that kind of thing, look at molecules within them. And molecular biology was just getting going then in a big way. And I did biochemistry at Cambridge. My part two, my last year was doing biochemistry. And that involved grinding everything up. So I began to feel that this was missing out most of the really interesting things about life. I realized that you'd never find out how a pigeon homes, which I really wanted to know, by grinding it up and looking at the enzymes in its liver. Or even by analyzing its DNA. And so I just began to feel less and less satisfied with this kind of biology, more and more doubtful about it. So I discovered the work of Goethe, the great German poet and botanist, with his holistic ideas about science. And this made me see that another kind of science was possible. This happened when I was a second-year undergraduate, I think. But I couldn't find anyone in the scientific world who wanted to discuss this. As far as they were concerned, the discovery of the structure of DNA, the growth of molecular biology was the way forward. I came to know Francis Crick quite well because he and his colleague Sidney Brenner, both of whom later got Nobel Prizes, had a special seminar for third-year biochemists. They picked about 6 people from the third year who they thought were the most promising. And we had evenings with them in Brenner's rooms in King's every week. We'd spend an evening together, and it was quite amazing just being with these very, very brilliant men. But what they were doing was basically grooming us to become molecular biologists, and all the others did become molecular biologists. It didn't work with me because I wasn't completely convinced by it. But basically they said, the structure of the gene is understood, the basic code of life is now known. The only 2 outstanding problems in biology are consciousness and development, how organisms develop. And then Francis Crick said, they haven't been solved because the people working on them, frankly, aren't very bright, and they don't know any molecular biology. But we're going to work on them. He said, I'm taking consciousness, Sydney's taking development, and we expect to solve them within 10 to 20 years. We invite you to join us. Most people did. I didn't. And they both got Nobel Prizes, and of course, they didn't solve the problems of development or consciousness. But they really believed they would, and so did a lot of people at that time. And Crick was himself a militant atheist, absolutely militant, and his driving goal, as his son Michael said at his funeral, was not to get rich or famous, but to hammer the last nails into the coffin of vitalism, namely the doctrine that living organisms are alive, as opposed to machines. So there was a lot of this kind of militant materialism and atheism in the scientific world. It was taken for granted. It was just assumed that that's your attitude, that's what you'd be. And there were a few people who were Christians, but they kept it quiet and just didn't want to bear the brunt of the attacks that would come their way. Anyway, I became more and more doubtful about this approach. And then I got a double first, and everyone assumed I'd go on to do research. But I then thought, well, do I really want to do this? Do I want to spend my life doing research on molecules and reducing life to molecular machinery? So I had a real crisis in my third year, not knowing what would happen. And then I saw this advertisement for a scholarship every year from Cambridge to Harvard, a year in the graduate school, and I applied for it, I got it. It was called a Frank Knox Fellowship. And I spent a year at Harvard doing history and philosophy of science because I wanted to step back and look at the bigger picture. This was in 1963 that I went to Harvard. Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, came out in 1962. And it was all the rage among historians of science at Harvard. It was incredibly exciting. Why it was exciting to me was that it showed that at any given time, science is dominated by a paradigm or a model of reality. And in a scientific revolution, a new model comes in. Before that, everything that doesn't fit is rejected, ignored, dismissed. And people work within what he called normal science, doing standard kind of thing within the permitted framework. But anything outside it can't be admitted. And I was quite sure a lot of things were being kept out of this mechanistic framework. And it was encouraging to me because it looked as if there could be an alternative, a newer view. And the kind of view I wanted was a more holistic view of nature alive, organisms really organisms rather than machines, and a much greater understanding of consciousness. Anyway, at Harvard, I did help me enormously in getting this bigger picture. And I went back to Cambridge and I did a PhD in plant development. I worked on plants because I didn't want to spend my career killing animals and guillotining rats and things, which is what you had to do if you were working on animal enzymes. And I really enjoyed working on plants. But I still wanted to find a way of working more holistically. And I came across a group called the Epiphany of Philosophers in Cambridge, which was a rather eccentric group of people. It consisted of several philosophers, the professor of philosophy of science, Richard Braithwaite, a fellow of King's, Professor Dorothy Emmett, who was professor at Manchester of philosophy, who'd studied with Alfred North Whitehead, Margaret Masterman, who was Richard Braithwaite's wife and a pioneer of artificial intelligence. Some of the very first steps to artificial intelligence were done in her Cambridge Language Research Laboratory. There was a couple of quantum physicists. There were several hippies. There were people doing Tai Chi. There were a few mystical monks, both Christian and Indian. And this group used to meet. We had week-long retreats 4 times a year in a windmill in Norfolk at Burnham Overy Staithe on the North Norfolk coast. We lived as a community. And every morning we had seminars where people would present ideas, and it didn't matter how outrageous the idea. You could present anything you liked, but you had to be able to defend it. So we were talking about alternative medicine, parapsychology, quantum non-locality, Eastern philosophy. But they were very hard-hitting, these seminars. People were quite often reduced to tears. No nonsense was tolerated, but there was a tremendous broad scope. I found this an immensely stimulating environment. And Margaret Masterman was a Christian mystic, and they introduced me to the Christian mystical tradition. And this group had a magazine, a journal called Theoria to Theory. Theoria is the Greek word for mystical intuition or experience. Theory, as in scientific theory, and to, T-O. And the idea was to find a bridge between mystical intuition and theory, philosophy and science. Margaret Masterman took the view that the conflict between science and religion, insofar as science denied mystical experience, meant there must be something wrong with science. Now, almost everybody else who dealt with the conflicts between science and religion thought there must be something wrong with religion. So at that time, there were a lot of Anglican theologians trying to demythologize religion and cut it down so it fitted onto the Procrustean bed of mechanistic science. But she was a fire-raising radical who believed that it was completely the other way around, and that there was something radically wrong with science, radically limited, and that we desperately needed a major paradigm change. And that's why we were discussing all these things that were excluded from regular science, like telepathy, parapsychology, acupuncture, mystical experiences, altered states of consciousness, and psychedelics. So this, for me, was an enormously stimulating group to be with. In our retreats, we had a rather unusual format that we lived as a community. Every morning and evening at the top of the windmill, the top room became the chapel, and everyone dressed up in white albs, long white robes. And we said the Anglican matins and evensong, morning and evening prayer every day. We chanted the Psalms in plain song. So I learned Gregorian chanting. And I loved the chanting. I, at that stage, was still an atheist, so I didn't really go along with the sort of religious part of it, but I enjoyed the community, the chanting. And it was also, it had terrifying moments. Every morning in the matins, there was a thing called the chapter of faults, where you had to confess your faults for the previous day. And it wasn't like deep existential faults. It was like not doing your fair share of the washing up, that kind of thing. And at the end of your confession, you had to kneel and confess to the group. At the end of the confession, you had to say, if anyone has anything to remind me of, I'd be grateful to be told. And I dreaded that bit, because Margaret Masterman was never slow in reminding people of faults. She was a formidable woman and quite terrifying at times. And so the chapter of faults often went on quite a long time. But it did form a way of letting off steam every day and kept the community functioning fairly smoothly. Anyway, this period at Cambridge was for me very encouraging, because I was thinking about new ways of doing biology, how biology could be done more holistically. And I got interested in the idea of morphogenetic fields, form-shaping fields, kind of top-down causation as opposed to bottom-up causation. I was really grappling with how plants grow, why leaves are shaped like leaves, why flowers petals have the shape they do, and so on. All the genes in every cell of the plant are the same, and yet the petals are different from the sepals, and they're different from the stamen, and they're different from the roots and the shoots, and the different tissues of the leaves, and so on. So when thinking about this, the idea of organizing fields was already established in biology, a more holistic tradition of biology, but no one knew how they could be inherited. And at this stage, I was reading philosophy by particularly the philosopher Henri Bergson, the French philosopher, his book Matter and Memory, which gave the idea of memory being transmitted directly across time, not having to be carried in molecules or material structures, a kind of causal influence that could leap across time. And I realized that if that happened in biology, it could lead to a completely new interpretation of inheritance. And that led to the idea of morphic resonance, the idea of similar things influence subsequent similar things in self-organizing systems across time and space. So this idea came to me in a flash around 1973. I was a fellow of Clare College at that stage and director of studies in cell biology. And this idea obviously was way off the map of what was going on in the biochemistry department where I was working. And I was terribly excited for several days. I mean, the whole world was suddenly looking completely different. Ideas were just pouring in. So I tried to communicate some of this excitement to my colleagues in the biochemistry department. Went over like a lead balloon. I did better on High Table at Clare, where some of the philosophers and historians were open to talking about this, and in fact were enormously helpful. But it became clear to me that I couldn't go on doing biochemistry and pursue these ideas. So I resigned my fellowship in 1974, and I took a job in a agricultural research institute in India. The reason I did that was because earlier in 1968, soon after I'd been elected to a research fellowship at Clare College, I was very interested in tropical plants and tropical biology. I'd been enthused by a professor of botany at Cambridge when I was studying botany, called E.J.H. Corner, C-O-R-N-E-R, who had spent many years working in Malaya and had worked at the Singapore Botanic Garden. In fact, during the Japanese occupation, he was interned in the Singapore Botanic Garden, which for him proved to be a godsend. The occupying Japanese officer was a keen botanist, and so was quite happy for Corner to spend the whole of the war interned in the herbarium and in the Botanic Garden, which enormously deepened his understanding of tropical plants. And he used to say, you can't really understand biology unless you've lived and worked in the tropics, because there's such a greater diversity, hundreds of species per acre, whereas here in Britain, of trees, here in Britain you might have 5 species in an acre of woodland, but as Corner pointed out, the diversity is huge in the tropics, and as you go north and south, it gets less and less and less until when you get to really northern or southern latitudes, there's just a very few species. So anyway, I got this Royal Society Travelling Award to go and work in the botany department of the University of Malaya in 1968. And the Royal Society gave me one of those old-style airline tickets that I discovered you could change at will. So I changed it. Instead of going straight to Kuala Lumpur, I changed it. I got off at Delhi, planning to spend a few days, say, sampling India, just seeing what India was like. And I was bowled over by India. In Delhi, I ran into the only person I knew in India was a research student, a friend of mine from Cambridge, doing anthropology research. And we just bumped into each other in Delhi by chance. He was just there for a few days. It was remarkable. And he said, look, I'm just going back to my village in the Himalayan foothills. Would you like to come? So I said, wow, yes. And I'd been in India 2 or 3 days. And he said, well, we have to take a train, an overnight train to Pathankot. Then we have to get a bus. Then we have to change to another bus. And then we have to walk about 4 hours to get to the village. I said, well, that sounds all right. So that's it. So off we went. And when we got to the village, he'd been there 2 years. He spoke the local language, Pahari, which is a bit like Hindi. He was living in the family of a Ved, a herbal doctor. There was no electricity, no radio, no television. He told them I was his cousin, so they accepted me as a member of the family. We were living in this herbal doctor's house. It was very simple. They were quite poor, the people, but a wonderful atmosphere. And the holy fire. The wife of the doctor was cooking things. At one stage, I had some waste paper in my pocket, and I was just about to throw it on the fire. And he said, "Oh, for heaven's sake, don't. This is the holy fire. It's the center of the house. You can't just defile it by throwing rubbish on it." I soon learned there are rules, and it was quite unlike anything I'd expected. I was completely enchanted by this rural Indian life, pre-television and pre-electricity. It was life as it had gone on for centuries. One day we were taking a walk along a valley. It was a fast-flowing mountain stream. And there was a cliff by the valley, and there was a cave. And in it was this orange-clad figure who shouted out to him, who knew him, my friend Johnny. He said, "Johnny's out." He said, "Oh, let's go and talk to the sadhu, the local holy man." So I said, "Okay." So we went and sat with the sadhu in his cave. He then produced a small clay contraption, which he called a chillum, and started putting things in it and smoking it, and asked if I'd like to try it. I didn't know what it was. I thought it might be cannabis, but I wasn't quite sure. I'd never had cannabis before. And anyway, he showed me how to smoke it with a bit of dirty cloth wrapped around the bottom, and you had to suck it. So I had a few puffs on this thing, and I had the most extraordinary experience. My mind opened up. The mountains, the snow-capped Himalayas became supremely beautiful. The grass seemed vastly greener than ever. I felt the presence of God. I felt this divine presence. He invoked Shiva before he took it. He said, "This is Shiva's holy plant." And for me, it was a completely transformative experience. Suddenly, the world looked totally different. And when I came to leave the village, the wife of the Brahmin herbal doctor did a little ceremony. We had to leave about 4 a.m. to walk to get the first bus and walk in the dark to start with. And she gave me, put kumkum on my forehead and gave me a blessing and sprinkled holy water on me and said that this was a blessing that I would return to India, where it came true 6 years later. But for me, this was a tremendous opening, and I couldn't leave India straight away, so I managed to extend my ticket for another 2 months. So I then traveled through Benares, Varanasi, and visiting temples. And I found I could, by giving lectures at botany departments around India, from one professor to another, I got introductions. I got put up free at Benares, Calcutta, Madurai, Madras, at a whole range of universities. It just blew my mind. In Benares, for example, I was taken around by a graduate student delegated to show me around. We went into a temple that was absolutely full of rats. And I said, why are there so many rats in this temple? He said, because it is a rat temple. And I said, well, he said, the rat is a sacred animal, the vehicle of Lord Ganesh. He said, this is the rat temple. So, and there were people feeding the rats. You know, there were devout Hindus coming in and sort of shoveling food out on these rats, and hundreds and hundreds of rats, sacred rats. Well, I mean, as I traveled through India, there were many, many things that surprised me, and that was one of them. Then I had a month in Sri Lanka. I thought, well, why rush to Malaya so soon? And there I came across Buddhists, and I spent a while in a Buddhist monastery. A monk explained to me about meditation. Didn't know about meditation. So fascinated by that. Then I had 9 months in Malaya, at the University of Malaya. At weekends, a group of us, mostly expatriates, mainly Australians, we went and visited desert islands. We had fishermen leave us on, cast us away on desert islands and pick us up on Sunday night. We went into the forest, the jungles. I went on forest expeditions. It was an amazing experience. And living among Muslims, most Malays are Muslim, Hindus, Indians, and Chinese, going to Chinese temples. It was a most exotic period. And after that, I traveled on the way back to Cambridge through Laos and Cambodia and Thailand. And I got back to Cambridge, and it was still during term time, and I had this unbelievable year away, and I went to dinner on high table, put on my gown, everything looked exactly the same, and everyone looked exactly the same. And one or two of the older fellows said, oh, hello, Sheldrake, haven't seen you for a while. Have you been somewhere? I said, well, yes. Where? Malaya. Oh, yes, yes. I said, have you heard that so-and-so's done so-and-so? I mean, it was just straight back into Cambridge gossip, and you know, as if it had never happened. Anyway, in 1974, I took this job in this agricultural institute in Hyderabad, I was working on crop improvement of chickpeas and pigeon peas. I had to work in farmers' fields. I had to travel all over India. Some of my experiments with chickpeas I did on the border of Tibet. You can't grow them in the plains of India in the summer months, but you can grow them right up in the mountains. So I was up in Lahul Spiti district on Tibetan frontier. It was closed to foreigners at the time, but I could go there because it was a special project. Living with a Tibetan family in their house, a polyandrous household, 1 wife, 6 husbands. That's the system there. The land goes through women, and they don't want to split it up. So 1 woman inherits all the land of the family, and then she has to marry to have men to work the land, and the more the better. So they marry a whole clutch of brothers as a package deal. She got 6 brothers as her husbands, and I asked discreetly whether they took it in turns and so on. Apparently, more or less, yes. And so I was living in this polyandrous household with everyone dressed in Tibetan robes. The Tibetan temple. There were Tibetan monks immersed in this Tibetan world. It was astonishing, unchanged. And in Hyderabad itself, I didn't want to live in a suburban-style home like most of my expatriate colleagues. I rented a wing of a crumbling palace from one of the Rajas, and that was much more spectacular. The trouble is the roof leaked during the monsoon, and there were rats, and there was a cobra lived in the garden, and I sometimes found it in my lavatory. At first I tried to get my cook to get rid of it, my Hindu cook. He said we couldn't get rid of the cobra. He said it is a sacred snake. Cobra is Nag, and Nag is, we have Nag Puja next week. And they invited me, all the servants and the Raja went to the cobra's nest in a termite hill in the garden. They knew where it was. Burnt incense sticks, offered it saucers of milk. And the cobra was honored. When a rat ran over my face one night when I was asleep, I was paralyzed. I had sleep paralysis. I asked my cook to get rid of it. And when I went to work the next day, and when I got back, he'd caught it in one of those live traps, a kind of cage with the live rat in. So I said, well, what are you going to do with it now? I said, I don't want it here. Can you kill it? He said, no, sir, we cannot kill the rat. It is a sacred animal, sir. It's a vehicle of Ganesh. So I knew that already. So I realized I'd made a terrible mistake. So I said, well, can you just take it away? And he said, yes, sir. So he put it on his bicycle and pedaled off and came back after a while. And he said, I've taken it 2 miles away, sir. I said, very good. Well, so after that, I noticed as I went round Hyderabad, all over Hyderabad, there were people on bicycles with rats in these traps at the back, taking them somewhere else. So the total number of rats remained the same. They were just redistributed. Anyway, I got really interested in going to Hindu temples, discourses. I was doing meditation. I was doing yoga. At Cambridge, after my Malayan trip, I encountered LSD for the first time in 1971, which had had a huge effect on me in terms of opening my view of consciousness. In my case, it was all too true that cannabis proved to be a gateway drug to psychedelics. This experience made me very interested in exploring consciousness without drugs. So I learned transcendental meditation and took up yoga, and I continued that in India. I became very friendly with a Muslim family, and the grandfather of my friend was a Sufi saint. So I got to know this Sufi saint who became very friendly with. And I used to go, he was a poet, and I loved visiting him because he'd sit there in his wonderful brocade Shivani, running his hands through bowls of jasmine flowers. And I wasn't used to this. So I thought religious people ought to be austere. But the lesson I learned from him was that no, all these pleasures are a gift from God. And and he had wonderful perfumes. He had beautiful clothes. He had lovely poetry. He'd recite to me, translate it from the Urdu. And he taught me a form of Sufi meditation. So for a year or so, I did a wazifa, which is like a Sufi mantra, and had this Sufi teacher. He died, and I was one of those honored to carry his body to the burial ground. All of this was going on in Hyderabad, and I went to see a Hindu guru at an ashram and asked his spiritual advice, and he said rather unexpectedly, well, you come from a Christian family, from a Christian country. He said, all religions are paths to God. He said, you should take a Christian path. I thought, oh, that's a new idea. Hadn't occurred to me. Then I thought, actually, I'd had this huge blind spot. The only thing I'd never really thought of was Christianity, because the atheist propaganda I'd absorbed is really principally anti-Christian. It grew up in reaction against Christianity, and its primary target is Christianity. So I started saying the Lord's Prayer as part of after my meditation. And then I started going to the local Anglican church, St. John's, Secundrabad, built by Royal Engineers in the colonial period. And really enjoyed doing that. I found, I really enjoyed being back with familiar words, the Book of Common Prayer, and I was confirmed in the Church of South India at the age of 34. But it still seemed to me a little bit lacking in some of the deeper aspects of spirituality. And then a friend who traveled around various ashrams told me about someone called Father Bede Griffiths, who lived in a small Christian ashram in Tamil Nadu, right in the south of India, and said you should go and visit him. So I did. And I was absolutely amazed. Here was this marvelous man, tall, looked a bit like Gandalf. He was wearing orange robes, living in this Christian ashram. He'd been at Oxford. He was taught by C.S. Lewis. He became a great friend of C.S. Lewis's, who'd been a monk, a Benedictine monk in England, but had spent 25 years in India, integrating the Christian and the Hindu tradition. He was extremely well versed in the Upanishads, the Hindu mystical tradition. In the ashram, there's 2 hours meditation a day, an hour in the morning, an hour in the evening. I used to sit on the bank of the sacred river Cauvery to do my meditation. There was yoga. The midday service of Mass began with the chanting of the Gayatri mantra, which is one of the great Hindu mantras. And I said to Father Bede, how can you chant the Gayatri mantra in a Catholic ashram? And he said, precisely because it's Catholic. He said, Catholic means universal, and anything that excludes a path to truth is merely a sect. So I loved his view of Catholicism as a universal approach. Anyway, I met him, I was very taken by him, and I said, I want to write a book about morphic resonance. I can't do it while I'm doing my agricultural research. I'll have to take a year or 2 off. But I'd love to be able to do it in India. So he said, well, come and live here, and you can do it here. So after working in my job for over 4 years, I took time off and went and lived in his ashram, which was lovely. It was a small community. It was very friendly. There was chanting every day. There was meditation and yoga. Father Bede was enormously stimulating to talk to. I had a palm-thatched hut where I wrote my book with a fountain pen and school exercise books I bought from the village shop. And I lived very, very simply. I lived for 1.5 years there, and at the end of it, I talked to the monk who ran the finances, and I said, look, I've been contributing to help various village schemes the ashram has, but just to know how much would it cost for my being here for 1.5 years? What would the actual cost be? Because I certainly want to give more than that. He said, well, the actual cost of living here for 1.5 years, the food and all the services and everything here, he said it's about $150. So $150, I thought, I've got enough in the bank to last for the rest of my life. So it really freed me from money worries, because I realized that I could live simply. It was one of the happiest times of my life. I was living with absolutely minimal carbon footprint or any other kind of footprint in the simplest way possible. Anyway, Father Bede was a huge help to me in rediscovering the Christian tradition and seeing how it could link to the insights of the Hindu tradition, particularly through the idea of the Holy Trinity. The ashram was called, in English, the Ashram of the Holy Trinity. In Sanskrit, it was called Sat Chit Ananda Ashram. And as many of you probably know, the Hindu conception of ultimate consciousness or reality, especially in Advaitic Vedanta, is that the ultimate consciousness on which all else depends, on which the whole universe depends, on which all individual consciousnesses, yours and mine, depend, is called Sat Chit Ananda. It's threefold. Sat means being, It's conscious being. Chit means consciousness, the contents of consciousness, what you can know. And Ananda is bliss or joy. So the idea is the ultimate consciousness is the knower and also the known, because both have to be part of consciousness, knower and known. It's not an undifferentiated blob, as it were. There's a structure within ultimate consciousness, and part of its very nature is bliss or joy, which is why mystical experiences of connection with the divine are usually supremely joyful or blissful, because that's the divine conscious nature. And the Hindu view is that all forms of consciousness, including yours and mine, are part of that ultimate consciousness, a bit like sparks of the divine, or if you like, fractals. They don't use the word fractal, but like fractal derivatives. One of the very familiar similes that they use in India is saying, imagine seeing the moon reflected in hundreds of buckets of water at night. Every bucket looks as if it's got a separate moon in it. But it's the same moon, just reflected in all these different buckets, in each one set differently. And so our consciousness is part of the divine consciousness. And that's why through meditation, through going to the ground of our own consciousness, we connect with the divine consciousness. That's why meditation is such an important part of Hindu and Buddhist practice, and indeed of Christian contemplative practice in monasteries and convents throughout the centuries. So there are many forms of this Trinity. I mean, another Hindu version is with the three main gods, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. Brahma is the ultimate source or creator, the ground of all things. Vishnu is the God who preserves order and form, the preserver, keeps things in order and form. And Shiva is the creator and the destroyer, portrayed as in dancing or in flames of fire, or in the erect lingam or phallus, as the kind of energetic principle. And as Father Bede pointed out to me, the Christian doctrine of the Holy Trinity is very similar. The ultimate understanding of God in the Christian tradition is the Holy Trinity. That's why all Orthodox churches, including Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Anglican, Methodist, so on, practically all have the Holy Trinity as the central conception of God. And what this is saying is that ultimate reality, God's consciousness, is not undifferentiated. It has this division, or differentiable aspects within it. God the Father is equivalent to Sat in the Hindu system, conscious being in the present. And when God announces himself to Moses in the Old Testament, and Moses says, "What's your name?" at the burning bush, he says, "I am who I am," or "I am that I am." So it's conscious being in the present is the very definition of that aspect of God. Then the second person of the Holy Trinity is the Logos, the Word. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, the Word was God. So the Logos is very similar to the Platonic idea, the ideas in Plato's philosophy in a Christianized form. It's the ideas, forms, patterns, structures of everything. It's what gives form, pattern, or structure to everything in the universe. Through him all things were made. The Logos, the second person of the Trinity, is not the same as Jesus of Nazareth. Obviously, the whole universe wasn't made through Jesus of Nazareth, born in AD 0 in Nazareth or in Bethlehem. But the divine aspect of Christ, the second person of the Trinity, the Logos, is this ultimate formative principle. And then the Holy Spirit is the principle of movement, change, dynamism, and underlies all things through activity. And the principal metaphor is speech. As it comes in spirit means breath or wind, and Logos means word. Even at the very beginning of the book of Genesis, you get this, and God said, well, the first, verse 2, the Spirit of God moved on the face of the waters. The Spirit is wind. Wind moving on the face of the deep creates waves. So it's a kind of vibratory pattern of activity. And then verse 3, and God said, let there be light. A word is a pattern, a form, a structure, a pattern of vibration. And in order to speak words, you have to have the flow of breath. Like when I'm speaking now, you wouldn't hear any of the words I'm speaking unless my breath was flowing out and carrying the words with it. If I had just the words in my mind, they'd be silent and they wouldn't manifest into the world. If I have just the breath, it has no structure, it's kind of white noise, and it doesn't have any form or pattern. But the two together make up the spoken word. So there has to be the speaker, the breath, and the logos. And this model that's the fundamental metaphor of the Holy Trinity, is, I think, a model for the whole of nature. If God is the source of all nature and the sustainer of all nature, I mean, the traditional Christian view is not that God made the universe in the first place like a machine, designed it like an engineer, fine-tuned the laws and constants, and then pressed the start button to give the Big Bang, and then stepped back, and the whole of nature then went on automatically just by itself. That's the kind of God that atheists like Richard Dawkins don't believe in, is that kind of God, and I don't believe in that kind of God either. The kind of God that traditional Christian theology believes in is that God sustains the entire universe the entire time and underlies everything that happens. So the ultimate source of all form in nature, the form of words, the structure of words, the form of our bodies, the forms of flowers, of crystals, of planets, of galaxies, the ultimate source of form is the logos, the formative principle. The ultimate source of energy is the spirit, and everything in nature is propelled by energy, and everything depends on energy for its actuality. Even the simplest atoms of matter are energetic vibrations, energy bound within fields, within the quantum fields of quantum fields theory, giving protons, neutrons, nuclei, electrons. These things are shaped by fields, which are part of quantum field theory, but they wouldn't have any reality without the energy that those fields bind. So everything in nature is a kind of reflection of these ultimate principles when seen through this lens. It's certainly the way I see it myself. So as I now see it, I see God in nature and nature in God, rather than a remote God who's a kind of optional extra who made a machine universe and pressed the start button, and then all of it goes on automatically with dead unconscious matter, as in mechanistic science. And this view also enables us to see how there can be various forms of consciousness all through nature, not just in brains. It's an interesting development in modern intellectual life that panpsychism, the idea of consciousness very widely distributed in nature, is now becoming very fashionable in the academic world. It's somewhat surprising that this is happening, but it is. And the reason it's happening is because mechanistic materialism has one very, very, very big problem. In fact, it's called the hard problem, which is that mechanistic materialism says the whole universe consists of unconscious matter, or unconscious physical reality, and there's nothing but unconscious matter. Then, of course, the problem arises that how come we're conscious? We ought not to be. And a number of eminent philosophers, materialist philosophers, have spent their entire careers trying to prove we're not conscious, and that it's only just neural activity, and to talk of consciousness is just a kind of folk superstition that will finally be got rid of when neuroscience has advanced far enough. There's also, of course, in that worldview, no free will. But, of course, it's self-contradictory. I mean, to try and persuade people that they've got no free will by reasoned argument on the basis of mechanistic science presupposes they're conscious, and also they have a freedom to choose your point of view. Other philosophers have taken a different line. They've said, well, consciousness is nothing but the activity of the brain, but the brain produces consciousness as a kind of illusion inside the head. But as their critics have pointed out, illusion is itself a mode of consciousness. So it doesn't explain consciousness, it presupposes it. And that's why it's called the hard problem. The very existence of consciousness is not explained by mechanistic science, even though you have to be conscious to do mechanistic science. It's presupposed by the very act of science itself. So what's happened is that some philosophers, notably Galen Strawson and Philip Goff here in Britain, and philosophers all over the world, in the recent decade or two, have started saying, well, if you say there's just a tiny little bit of consciousness in an electron, a little bit more in an atom, a bit more in a molecule, then by the time you get to a brain, which is very complicated, then you can have full-scale consciousness. And it just emerges. It's different in degree, but not in kind. Now, they don't let this consciousness of the electron or proton make the slightest difference to physics. What they want is to say, well, we'll just say it's there, then it'll be business as usual within science. They're trying to solve the hard problem the easy way. The problem is that you don't need to stop at the human brain. I wrote a paper a couple of years ago called Is the Sun Conscious?, which is published in the Journal of Consciousness Studies, taking them at their word. If you think panpsychism means consciousness in all self-organized systems, then what about the sun? You can make good arguments for the sun being conscious. I try to do it in my paper, which you can read on my website. And if the sun's conscious, then what about the stars? And if the stars are conscious, then what about the whole galaxy? Could there be a galactic mind? And if the galaxy is conscious, what about the whole cosmos? And then we get back to a familiar view of the whole cosmic mind, what Dionysius, what Plato and the Neoplatonists and many of the Neoplatonist theologians of the Middle Ages believed that the whole universe has a soul or mind, the anima mundi, that God is reflected. The second person of the Trinity, the Logos, the cosmic Christ, is the incarnation of God in the whole universe, with this cosmic mind underlying all things. And this view is called panentheism, God in nature and nature in God. So let me just see. I shall end by just saying that some of my recent work has been looking at the science behind spiritual practices. All religions have spiritual practices like meditation, prayer, fasting, connecting with nature, singing and chanting, rituals, and pilgrimage. And in my book, Science and Spiritual Practices, I show how these practices common to all religions are now supported by science. The thousands of scientific studies have shown that people who have spiritual or religious practices are, on the whole, healthier, happier, and live longer than those that don't. The converse must be true, that those who don't have them are unhappier, unhealthier, and live shorter, which is why I often say militant atheism should come with a health warning. Because it puts people off their traditional religious practices and doesn't give them anything else in its stead. However, a number of modern atheists, like Sam Harris, have now taken up spiritual practices precisely because they recognize they have value. He's now giving online meditation courses. So spiritual practices there's no doubt they work. They have measurable scientific effects. I discuss 7 in my book, Ways, Science and Spiritual Practices, and 7 more in my most recent book, Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work. And one of them is pilgrimage. And one of the things I'm very keen on is pilgrimage, the revival of pilgrimage that's happening here in Britain and elsewhere in Europe at the moment. And my colleague, Guy Hayward, Dr. Guy Hayward, who happens to be here in the front row, is the director of the British Pilgrimage Trust, and which is reopening ancient footpath pilgrimages all over Britain. so that people can once again walk to the great holy places. Pilgrimage was suppressed at the Protestant Reformation in 1538. It was banned by Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell. It was made illegal. The shrines were destroyed. Pilgrims were stopped from going on pilgrimages. The infrastructure, which was the monasteries, were dissolved. But now there's a revival of pilgrimage happening here and all over Europe. And there are wonderful pilgrimages right here in London. I've been on several with Guy here in London. And when you do that, you realize that London is full of holy places, and it becomes, instead of just a secular city with lots of traffic and business and commerce, you suddenly see it through a completely new lens. And indeed, all cities traditionally have sacred centers to them. Temples in Sumeria and Babylon were at the center of the city, as they are at the center of many Hindu cities like Madurai. So sacred places are not just in the country, although there are some wonderful ones in the country. They're in cities, and in fact, in England, our great cathedrals define a city traditionally. Wells and Southall, or Southwell, are cities, even though they're very small towns, because they have cathedrals, whereas a lot of very big towns are not cities, because they don't have cathedrals. So holy places are part of urban and rural life, and rediscovering them and walking between them is a fantastic way of reconnecting with this tradition. Well, that's enough from me, really. But I think that this revival of pilgrimage and of spiritual practices and the anatheism, the rediscovery of God that's going on in increasing speed at the moment is one of the most interesting and hopeful things in the modern world. And heaven knows there aren't many hopeful and interesting things in the modern world. And this is one of them. And I think it's probably the most important of them all, because I think it helps reconnect us with ourselves, with each other, with that which is beyond the human level, with the natural world, and gives us hope and vision for doing something about the many crises which are unfolding around us. Thank you.
Hello, Rupert. Would you like to take some questions from the audience?
Yes, yes. Could you find the people who are ask them? I don't want to choose the people. If you can find people who want to ask them and give them the
Well, the
microphone,
first hand I see went up was this one. So
yes.
if you could kindly please put your hand up, and I'll try and get round to some of you. I can't take all of them, but I'll actually just come round and, let you ask questions. Thank you.
Hello, Rupert. Thank you so much. You're a real gift to all of us. Really appreciate you sharing so much about your life. I come from the Sufi tradition, and like you, I have a connection with India, and I've been spending time with Buddhist monks in monasteries and Hindu monks in ashrams, and I've been actually doing the same kind of synthesis between the Islamic traditions and learning from, as you described yourself. I've seen the beauty across those different traditions. So today I'm a practicing Muslim, just as you are a practicing Christian, but I consider myself a perennialist in the sense of seeing the ability of all traditions to take us to the same ultimate destination. I was wondering if you would identify similarly, or do you look at perennialism differently? Thank you.
Yes, well, I definitely think that there's a common ground to all religious traditions, which is really that state of that we can directly experience through mystical experience. All religions come from that mystical insight. Without it, it's not. People don't believe in God, the great founders of religions, because they've read about God in books. They believe because they've had a direct experience. And of course, the way we interpret that experience depends on our language and our our culture and so on. But Father Bede used to say that it's as if they're central, this experience of being part of this things vastly greater than ourselves and vastly beyond human conceptual thought. It's like the palm of the hand. And then the fingers of the hand are like the different religious traditions that come out of it and lead back into it. And each finger is different, and each religious tradition is different. Its language and its stories and its sacred writings and its rituals are different. But there's some way in which they point to something that they have in common. And sometimes this is called the perennial philosophy. But I think perennial philosophy is a bit misleading because it's not really a philosophy, which might imply something you read in books or study in seminar rooms. It's more a kind of experience that people share. And one of Father Bede's, he was my main teacher, which is why I keep referring to him. One of the things he found in interreligious dialogue was that if you try talking to people about the doctrines and the tradition and stuff, then you easily get bogged down in what's right and what's wrong. Even within each religion, there are people who quarrel with each other, Protestants, Catholics, Sunnis, Shias, and so on. What he found worked, and what I find really works too when I've done it, is not ask people what the theory is, but what they actually do. So like, how do you actually pray? How do you actually meditate? How do you go on pilgrimage and stuff? And then share the experience, and then it becomes a lot more in common emerges from that. So I take, although I'm a practicing Christian, I find myself at home in Hindu ashrams, most of the ones I've been to, among Sufis. I recently visited a Sufi group in Amman, Jordan. I spent several very happy days with this group of Sufis and found so much in common. So I've had this experience over and over again of the sense that we differ, but the ultimate thing that is most important is not different. How can it be? If there's an ultimate unity underlying all things, it can't be divided up into little bits or segments. The way we interpret it or speak about it can, but the ultimate unity by definition is an ultimate unity.
Hello, Rupert. Thank you so much for that talk. It's wonderful to be here and listen to you. I have a question which I need to preface a bit by explaining where I'm coming from with it, which is that I was raised Catholic in Ireland, then swiftly bounced away from it as I got older and had similar realizations to you. And now I've just found myself in the world of shamanism in the Mongolian tradition. My teacher is a shaman from Mongolia. And what really struck me with that was the role of feminine energy in shamanism and animism generally. It's got a much more pronounced role that's equally celebrated as the role of masculine energy. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that within Christianity and the role of the feminine is there. I know there's the Virgin Mary. And I left all of this when I was quite young, so I'm similarly, maybe having a bit of anatheism going on as well. But yeah, it seemed to me that there was a big lack there with Catholicism, so yeah.
Well, first of all, about shamanism, I think we have a lot to learn from shamanic traditions because they're often very much connected with the natural world, more so than mainstream religions, which have become a bit more disconnected from it. I think that the roots of all these religions are very shamanic. I mean, if you look at the Hebrew prophets like Elijah, they lived in caves in the wilderness. They were fed by ravens, it says, the account of Elijah there was a kind of strong shamanic element in the Hebrew prophets. Now, I think that and shamanic traditions around the world have retained this sense of connection with the animal and vegetative worlds, and that's why I think there's a lot to learn from them. In terms of female energy, I think it's certainly true that most religions have been pretty patriarchal for quite a long time. Not just religions, armies, governments, states, universities, I mean, everything you can think of, every institution. But I think one of the interesting features of Christianity is that women played such a very important part in it right from the beginning. And the Blessed Virgin Mary is a key figure. The first witness of Jesus' resurrection is St. Mary Magdalene, a woman. And the person who anoints Christ means the anointed one. And the only time he's ever anointed by anyone was not by a high priest, but by a woman who was usually identified with St. Mary Magdalene anointing his feet and him with oil. So I think in a sense, St. Mary Magdalene is the kind of archetypal priestess. And I think I'm a member of the Church of England. And in the Church of England, of course, we've had married priests since the Reformation. We now have women priests and bishops, and the vicar of this church is a woman. And one of the assistant vicar, Ayla Lapine, was a curate in our parish church in Hampstead before. So I think this is one of the things that's changing. You see, religions are not static, they evolve. And one of the things that's evolving, along with our changing conceptions of roles of women in society, is a recognition within the religious sphere. And it's happening more in some religions than others, and happening more in some churches than others. But I think it's a very important development, and personally I'm happy that it's happening in the Church of England in the way it is. I myself pray to the Blessed Virgin Mary. I say the Hail Mary every night as part of my prayers, and I also regard St. Mary Magdalene as my patron saint, or matron saint. So it's a very important part of my own practice.
Rupert, I want to say how inspiring you are to me, so thank you very much for that. I wanted to ask you, what combination of philosophy, science, and technology do you think has the greatest potential to deepen and increase our connection with the divine? And what do you think its potential is?
What connection of philosophy, technology, and science would help us most?
Yeah.
Well, I've written these 2 books on spiritual practices because I think there are several, a range of practices that can really help us. I think that sometimes you could say the technology of holy places, if you think of cathedrals, it's not exactly modern technology, it's medieval technology, but when you look at what they achieved in the Middle Ages with the great cathedrals like Lincoln or Canterbury or Wells or Salisbury, it's completely staggering. And there we have buildings designed to expand and open the mind. They're not functional spaces just to fulfill the most basic functions of people meeting together. The height, the stained glass windows and stuff. We already have an example of a technology that's been deployed in the service of the divine. And so we do in sacred architecture in all traditions. I mean, the wonderful mosques and tombs in the Islamic world, and temples in the Hindu world, and some of the great Buddhist statues and stupas and temples inspire us through beauty. I think one kind of possible technology or traditional use as well that can play a big part is psychedelics, Because I think for people who've been raised in the world of mechanistic materialism, as I was, who've been completely pervaded by that way of thinking, it may take a rather stronger shock to the system to get you out of it. And psychedelics have that role for a lot of young people, including me when I first took LSD, can be a kind of rite of passage into an expanded view of consciousness. And there are ways in which they can be used in a religious context. I mean, there are some people who, a small underground movement called Cathedrals on Cannabis, of people who visit cathedrals in altered states of consciousness and find it a most moving and powerful way of experiencing them. There's also psychedelic churches. I'm thinking particularly of Santo Daime, a Brazilian psychedelic church that emerged from the jungles of the Amazon when rubber tappers met shamans who took ayahuasca. In the 1930s, it began. It now has branches all over the world. And it's a church which integrates Christianity with the psychedelic experience. And I think that's a most interesting evolutionary development. The ceremonies start with the Our Father and the Hail Mary. And they see Jesus as one of the guides through, and the angels as guides through this psychedelic realm. The psychedelic realm is a vast realm of imagination. I think it's, as it were, a more intense version of the dream world, which has limitless possibilities. And it's easy to get lost there. And some people can encounter malevolent spirits, and it can be dangerous. So you need guides in that world. And the world of the ayahuasca-based Santo Daime has spirit guides in that world. And one reason they think it's important is because when you die, you're in that world. And a lot of people think that when you die, I think myself, when you die, it's like dreaming, but you can't wake up anymore because you haven't got a physical body to wake up in. So you're in a dream state. And the dream state can be horrible, like in Dante's Inferno. In a sense, Dante's Divine Comedy is like a description of an imaginal world after death that's a bit like a kind of intensified dream world or an intensified psychedelic world. And then there's purgatory, where people, in the Inferno, in Dante's Inferno, people are trapped in their obsessions. They just can't get out of their obsessive greed or their obsessive lust or whatever their obsessions are. They're trapped in them. In purgatory, they're able to move on, but gradually. And then when they reach the final book of Dante's Inferno, Paradiso, it's a bit like a dimethyltryptamine, DMT trip in slow motion. It's sort of a disembodied ascent into realms of light, encountering beings and angels of light and guides who help people through that process. And so I think that I think psychedelics are one possibility that would perhaps fit into your question. And then in terms of philosophy, then I think the philosophies that help us most are holistic philosophies and sciences, whereby we can see nature as alive, organic, and the whole universe as a kind of organism, as opposed to mechanistic theories. And I think when those are applied to medicine, as opposed to the currently orthodox mechanistic medicine, then we'll have better healing systems that work better, because they'll be more inclusive, include more healing methods and modalities, which again would be kinds of technologies. Anyway, it's a big question, and those just sketching in a few possible answers.
Thank you very much for your talk. This might provoke the shortest answer it's possible for one to give. Do you have any recollections of Krishnamurti, and did you meet David Bohm?
The answer is yes and yes. When my first book, A New Science of Life, came out, a book I wrote in Father Bede's ashram. It's my first book on morphic resonance. It's now available in a new, third, fully updated edition. When that book came out in 1981, I was invited by someone in London to meet Krishnamurti because he'd heard about my book and was very interested in it, because Krishnamurti, the Indian teacher, who was, for those of you who don't know about Jiddu Krishnamurti, he was promoted at first by the Theosophical Society, and then he broke away and became a teacher without any particular religious affiliation. And he often said, "I am not a guru." Actually, I think he was, but he said he wasn't. But he was a teacher, and many people followed him. And one of his doctrines was that if I undergo a transformation of consciousness, it makes it easier for everyone else to undergo it. He often said, "I am humanity," that we're all connected. So he very much liked my idea of morphic resonance, where we're all connected through a collective consciousness and unconscious. And so we had a dialogue in Britain. And then in 1982, I went to California for the first time when my book, A New Science of Life, came out in America. It was published in California, where I encountered all sorts of new people. I went to the Esalen Institute. I met Stan Groff, who was doing LSD research. I met Terence McKenna, who became a great friend of mine, and Ralph Abraham. We had many dialogues together. He was a kind of shamanic, psychedelic explorer. But one of the things that happened is I was invited to Krishnamurti's center in Ojai, California, where David Bohm was staying with him. And the person who invited me arranged for a series of dialogues between me and David Bohm and Krishnamurti. Two of them were filmed with a psychiatrist, an American psychiatrist, called The Nature of the Mind, and they're online on the internet. I also had a whole series of meetings with David Bohm. We got on extremely well. He was a quantum physicist, and he thought that my ideas about morphic resonance fitted very well with his ideas about quantum physics. In my book, A New Science of Life, there's an appendix of a dialogue between me and David Bohm about quantum physics and morphic resonance. And I met Krishnamurti many times because we got on very well. And for several years after our first meeting, I was spending the winters in India doing my old job in crop development in Hyderabad. Then I spent the May or June I was spent in California, and in the autumn I was here in England. So for several years, that happened to be Krishnamurti's pattern of movement. So we used to meet up in Adyar in Madras in India and have some dialogues there. Then we did some when he was in California, and then in England in the autumn. So I probably did about 10, 12, maybe 15 dialogues with Krishnamurti, all of which were recorded, and some of which are online in audio form at least. One of them's this video. By the time I met Krishnamurti, I'd already published my book on morphic resonance. I'd lived in Father Bede's ashram. I'd studied a lot about Hindu, Buddhist, and other thought. So I wasn't sort of like a disciple, and I wasn't afraid of him. And one of the reasons his followers wanted me to have these dialogues with him was because they were afraid of him and didn't really. He always said, "Let us discuss it, sir, in a dialogue together." But actually, as soon as people started trying to discuss it, he sort of took over. But when he did it with me, he said, "Let us discuss it." And I say, "Okay." So then he said, "I am humanity. So if one person is enlightened, all humanity is enlightened." That was one of his teachings. So I said, "Well, you've just been telling us what a sorry state the world is in. So obviously no one's been enlightened yet." He said, "Well, maybe more than one." I said, "Okay, well, how many? 10, 20, 100, 1,000, 10,000? Just a rough figure." And so anyway, it was fun. We teased each other, and we had fun. He liked it because we played with ideas, and he had a sense of humor, and we had a lot of fun talking to each other. So I really appreciated that. And I also tried to understand what his real teaching was, and because he wouldn't put it in an easy to understand way. And I think I got some inkling of what he was really trying to say, but he wouldn't give people a method. They all wanted a method, and he wouldn't give them a method. And he just said, you just become enlightened like that. It may have happened for him, but it didn't happen for most of his followers, or for most people. So it was kind of paradoxical. He was a teacher, but he refused to teach a method. And so anyway, we became, I would say we became friends, and so I became friends with David Bohm as well, and we saw eye to eye on a lot of questions within science. But the key dialogue is that one that's in A New Science of Life.
Rupert, I think we'll have to finish there. Thank you so much for recounting your experiences in such vivid detail. And it's been a very rich and inspiring evening. Thank you so much. Thank you.